Bore da, fy cyflwyniad heddiw yw yr economi llesiant a defnyddio profiad o fyw. Good morning. My presentation this morning is about the wellbeing economy and using lived experience. So what is a wellbeing economy? An economy designed to serve the well-being of people and the planet, first and foremost, and in doing so, delivers social justice on a healthy planet. And this is not a new concept. The call for the global economy to shift its focus beyond simply GDP as a measure of progress has been alive for decades. And leaders, including yourselves in all sectors and at all levels, are looking for a means to understand and measure what makes life worthwhile and the directions needed to deliver it. And this comes quite rightly from saying that well-being is determined by much more than money. It comes from the quality of our lives, our relationships, and how we feel about the future. And there are various models that you may be familiar with. There's new economy, well-being economy, circular economy, regenerative economy, donut economics, and community wealth building. In Wales, we're very lucky to have the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, which gives the ambition and legal obligation to improve the well-being of the population. Wales also, along with other governments, have formed the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. And this partnership has set out 5 core domains for a wellbeing economy, which you can see here on the slide, of dignity, nature, connection, fairness, and participation. And whilst the guiding principles for setting out the domains are similar across the countries, the models for action are different. But with this diversity of models, frameworks, and metrics comes a degree of complexity. And in order to be useful, practical, and viable, there does appear to be a need for more harmony in the way the metrics are thought about. So I'm going to draw on the recent discussion paper prepared by the Centre for Thriving Places. And I hope that you can see the colour table on the right-hand side here, and your videos are not falling over it. If they are, pick up the videos and move them over. And the paper looks at the key similarities and differences of the leading wellbeing economy models, and the Wellbeing Future Generations Act being one of them. And most of these provide a framework and a means to understand how the different drivers of progress sit together. From
you need me to go and get? No.
From the headlines here, you can see that all the models are clear in their overarching goals. So that's about thriving, fair, and green lives. The models agree that a flourishing place needs a clean, accessible environment, good and affordable housing, active travel, public transport, safe streets, and access to vital services. Our mental and physical health, as well as our learning and education, are also vital components across the life course and across these models, and an ability to connect with each other. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but we also need to be able to fully participate in local life. And beyond that, it's an economy that reinvests in the local community and a governance system that gives people a voice and promotes equity and human rights for all. And beneath all of this, it's care for the planet on which we depend. But the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act has been remarkable in terms of its breadth, coverage, and ambition. But the Senedd, as with many governments, faces challenges in making policy real, with a large gap between what was planned and what happens on the ground. And while the process of policy making often begins with a high-level wellbeing vision and works its way down, the actual achievement of the vision will be bottom-up through action and driven by transformations. But how are these actions evaluated? How is that evidence or knowledge built? What measures are used and why? And this leads me, should lead me to my next slide. So why use lived experience to evaluate, to inform policy, to inform investments, to build the evidence for prevention? There are many reasons why one would use lived experience, and I've highlighted several of those reasons here. The first, storytelling lends itself to participatory change processes because it relies on people to make sense of their own experience and environments. Stories can be used to focus on specific interventions, but also reflect the wide array of contextual factors that influence what the outcomes are. Stories can be systematically gathered and claims verified from independent sources or methods, and narrative data can be analysed using conceptual frameworks or looked at for the emerging themes that come through. More recently, there's also been software programs that facilitate the categorization of little story fragments that allow for patterns to be formed and to develop more quantitative information from it. And finally, narrative methods can be integrated into ongoing processes within organizations to aid in program planning, decision-making and strategic management. And we can look at this in a moment. So onto methods. Personal stories have long been an important part of evaluations, for example, being reported in case studies. And there are many methods, some of which are highlighted here, and there are others. The process of collecting stories usually begins with an interview, whether in a group, a story circle, focus groups, or in individual interviews. And there are different ways of recording this information, including standardized questionnaires, open-ended notes, and different narrative techniques to draw out, code, and aggregate some of the fragments of data, including methods such as most significant change, which you might be familiar with. And the methods there are thematic analysis, or hierarchical group analysis, otherwise known as a most significant change panel. There are also new techniques, as I mentioned earlier, such as the causal map application, which make it possible to conduct quantitative analysis based on the more qualitative, emotional, and open-ended narratives. I'm just going to highlight here a couple of methods. Deep, developing evidence-enriched practice, offers two storytelling methods for learning-focused evaluation, the magic moments, tragic moments, and most significant change. And Nick Andrews' contact is there. Nick is on the call and will be one of our colleagues that we're presenting with today. My final slides show a working example of a recent piece of evaluation that might put some of these ideas into context. So Circles of Support was a pilot project in Pembrokeshire, very much anchored in the strong multi-sectoral partnerships in the county, to see if the Circles of Support approach could contribute to supporting better social connectedness and the well-being of individuals. As a project, it very much represented a commitment, I think, by the local authority and by partners to trialling and evaluating new approaches to prevention and well-being, with evaluation an essential element from the outset, in then being able to make decisions about commissioned projects, ensuring the valuable learning was captured to inform future investments and activities. The steering group co-produced the research design, and the evaluation was led by Together for Change. And you can see here there were 5 stages of research. The overall design was mixed methods with qualitative data supplementing quantitative survey data. There were 2 surveys, one at the beginning, one partway through. There was a Path to the Future exercise, which was a reflective session with the group to explore magic moments and next steps. And then there was the most significant change story collection from course participants, the course trainer, the steering group member. And these were stories of change about the individual or about an organisation or for someone else. And the stories were analysed in 2 ways, a panel that explored the stories, identified the most significant, and then a thematic analysis that developed a coding index, then mapped and interpreted the stories. For the purposes of the workshop today, I've drawn a couple of conclusions from the conclusions and recommendations that came through, and I'm focusing on 2 generic points rather than the specific recommendations for Circles of Support: good relationships and combined research methods. And these 2 things were the enablers to ensuring the voice of those who the intervention was intended to support were actually central to the evaluation. And the purpose was really clear from the outset of the project and of the evaluation. So good relationships and combined research methods. Good relationships, it underpinned the project. The approach used represented a really effective model of partners working together to test new innovations and to pilot an approach to person-centered support. I think what came through very clearly in the evaluation was the role of co-producing the project from the beginning. Good relationships were paramount to the project working well in this respect. And secondly, the use of mixed methods. Building in research from the beginning was so important for the future use of the evaluation and its findings. Combining the MSc approaches with other research methods yielded really rich, sort of in-depth data. And because mixed methods were used, it was possible to triangulate across the data to make sure the evaluation was both robust enough and nuanced enough to inform the future investments and resourcing. And the survey data revealed slightly different perceptions of the project to the MSc stories itself. It was very useful to be able to cross-reference. And these two conclusions are cyclical. So good relationships enabled the project to happen and its evaluation, and to draw directly on the experiences of those people who were at the heart of it. And the evaluation highlighted the role of relationships to wellbeing, both for participants and the steering group. But because of those strong relationships and the clear purpose, the findings of the evaluation could then inform what happened next. So those relationships were really at the heart of it. And I think on that note, it's a good moment to hand over back to Sue with the baton.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's very good to be here. Jesse signed off by talking about the importance of good relationships, and that's really what I want to be talking about this morning. I want to cover, if I can, in my 10 minutes or so, three things. I want to talk a little bit about our vision for communities, because we don't know what our desired destination might be if we can't evaluate our progress towards it. I want to say a little bit about what we call relationship-centered practice, because that's about how we build the capacity to make that journey towards that destination. And if we don't know how we're going to build that capacity, then it's difficult for us to evaluate the impact that we might be deriving from it. And I want to conclude by saying something a little bit about the piece of work called Active Communities, which is a tool that we've developed for understanding and supporting our communities. I should probably say a little bit about the Relationships Project. As Sue said, my background is as a community development worker. And reflecting a few years ago on work over, as Sue very generously said, a number of decades, it occurred to me that whether we were working with children struggling at school, people sleeping on the street, a whole range of different kinds of issues in different contexts over the years. Whenever we unpeeled the onion, we would find relationships either broken down or never existing to a meaningful degree. And whether it was a policy response with government or a practical project response on the ground, over and over again, a big part of what we were doing was building, repairing, making new relationships. And so I began increasingly to think about relationships as both problem and solution. But at the same time, I think that we in the public sector in particular, but also more broadly in society, do relationships less and less well. So the Relationships Project was began really to think about that problem and to do three things: to look at where we do relationships well, and there are lots and lots of bright spots, see what we can learn from that, to develop tools and training and practical resources to support that kind of work elsewhere, and to build a field around relationships. So that's a very quick romp through what we do in the Relationships Project, but do have a look at our website and do make contact if you'd like to find out more. I want to start this morning by talking about what we describe as a virtuous circle on our next slide, Neil, because this really explains the context for Neil and me doing this slot together. We think about resourceful communities in a variety of different ways. We use different language to describe it, but the phrase that we use at the Relationships Project is ready for everything. We think communities that are ready to cope with adversity, so to deal with disaster, the kind of a situation that Neil will talk about a little bit later on. Communities that are strong enough to support one another in adversity, but that's not sufficient. We also think about ready communities as being ready to seize opportunity. So it's not just about resilience, but it's also about leading good and fulfilling lives. And Jess in her presentation talked about flourishing and thriving. This is what we mean when we talk about ready for everything communities. And on the next one, Neil, we think that those kinds of communities are characterized by strong relationships. And the phrase we use is putting relationships first. In many of the sorts of services that friends around the table this morning are representing, we could have a conversation about relationships in which people would say, yes, relationships are really, really important. They're absolutely at the front of my mind. But then they would go on to say, but health outcomes or educational outcomes or whatever it might be are my first priority. We would say that you can't achieve anything else if you're not thinking about relationships. You know, the teacher cannot achieve the attendance rate or the examination results if she isn't thinking about her relationship with the children's relationship with one another, the school's relationship with the home, and likewise across services. So we think the key thing here, and the characteristic of what we describe as relationship-centered practice, is this idea of putting relationships first, and both an end in itself and the means by which other goals are achieved. And we think that that practice is characterized by a set of behaviors, Neil, some of which are captured on this next slide. Shared purpose, that idea that we are collaborating, we can do this thing together. Not all a soft touch, so also about challenge and forgiveness, but essentially empathetic and collaborative behaviors in our individual behavior, and that is facilitated by organizational protocols captured in this next slide, which are really boxed into three categories in our mind. First, a strengths-based approach, focusing on the strengths rather than the weaknesses. Secondly, this idea of informed by experience. So it's not scripted, but nor is it just nice. It is rooted in practical experience. It's thoughtful, and it is skilled work. And we need to understand that there is that it is skilled and that it involves some emotional labor. And thirdly, that it is compelled from within. So we need to be committed to this kind of work. We need to believe that it's possible rather than kind of acting by rote, delivering ourselves. And we think that if we operate in these kinds of ways, to begin to think about how we operate in these kinds of ways, we need to ask ourselves a fundamental question. And this is how we begin the process of helping people and organizations to think about placing relationships at the center of their practice. We ask the question, how would your place change if relationships were the first mile? And importantly here, we mean, when we use the word your place, we invite you to interpret it however it has meaning for you. So it might be the team you lead, it might be the organization you run, it might be the town block you live in, a whole variety of different contexts in which you might interpret that word place. But how would it change if we thought about relationships before we thought about anything else? And that, we think, is the first step towards relationships. And we suggest that thinking about it in those ways is relevant in a variety of different contexts. First of all, it's relevant as an end in itself. So, for instance, for the care worker or the school mentor or the good neighbor, establishing and sustaining effective relationships is fundamental to the purpose of the role and how they see their job. Secondly, we might think of it as a means to an end. The example I mentioned earlier for the teacher, behavior, attendance, or academic performance might be the ultimate goal, but that's not achievable without good relationships. And thirdly, we think of it as a universal enabler. So perhaps for the police officer or the council manager, strong individual relationships aggregate into the kind of communities that Jesse was talking about at the beginning, and the kind of communities that I describe as really for everything. And so you see in this slide that we think about relationship practice as having relevance and utility for pretty much all of us. And when we take that picture, we think it's then helpful to look back at that question, how would our place change? And also ask ourselves a second question, not just how would our place change, what would we do differently, but also what other relationships might we need to work well, not just to be in place, but other relationships we need to work well for our place to change. And so, who else do we need to get on board? And you may say that this is an idealistic way of thinking about the world. It's a pretty vision, but it's a long way from where we are now. And I would just ask you my final set of thoughts to reflect back on the COVID experience of a couple of years ago with lockdowns, when in the Relationships Project, through the Relationships Observatory, we observed shifts in social behavior and in relationships, which I'm sure will be familiar to you. These shifts from doubting to trusting, from competing to cooperating, a shift in social behavior towards what we would describe as more relationship-centered practice. And we think that gives us both hope and optimism that some of the ideas I've just been talking about just now, both are doable and achievable. And although the dials have swung back, there's no doubt about that, the arrow on the dial has swung back over the last year to 18 months, we still see through the observatory and other work a lot of evidence that it hasn't returned to where it might have been back in 2018. So we believe there's plenty to build on. And some of the evidence, I was looking at evidence from a London borough just last week around volunteering numbers, 15% up from where they were back in 2018. A lot of evidence to give us belief that these ideas about moving towards more relational practices, communities that are characterized by relational practices, is not an unrealistic objective. My final set of ideas that I want to leave you with is another piece of work that emerged from thinking about particularly the mutual aid movement during lockdowns. On our next slide here, the next one's Neil, if I may, we began to think about the almost 9 million people who were involved in volunteering during that time, and in particular, two really stark statistics that emerged from our work with YouGov. One, 39% of those people had done little or no volunteering before. 70% expressed the desire to carry on doing it after the pandemic. Potentially a huge resource, a transformational resource in our communities, but not, as Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock described it, an army of volunteers. These were 9 million individual moral choices. So we did a piece of work on trying to break down that 9 million into individual categories. And we came up with these 5 categories of volunteer. I'll just very quickly rattle through them for you. And if you're interested in this and using this as a tool for your own working communities, do please have a look at the guide, which is on our website. The first one is the visionary disruptor. This is the person who is passionate, they're curious, they're ambitious. They see their volunteering really as the first step in building a new society. The second, if we can move on Neil, please, is the everyday carer. So these are the kind of established volunteers who were caring for people before the pandemic, will carry on afterwards. The third is the neighborly empathizer, those sociable companions who began to find meaning in the new neighborhood connections. You might think about them as sort of apprentice carers, as it were, new through the pandemic, but displaying very, very similar sorts of characteristics. The fourth, the practical tasker. This is the group that was most likely to have been new to volunteering through the pandemic, and really interesting to compare them to somebody like the everyday carer. The practical tasker likes a list of things to do. They like a clear structure around the work that they do. They even quite literally like having a badge and a t-shirt. The everyday carer runs a million miles from anything like that. So there are kinds of ways in which we might sustain the engagement of those two groups, really very, very different. And finally, we think about the community weaver, not necessarily the chair of the group, but the person that is actually weaving people together, making connections, reaching out to others across the community. And we think that thinking in those ways about how we begin to segment and understand our communities is really an important first step towards understanding how we build more thoughtful and careful relationships and reach out towards that community that is based on relationship-centered practice and is genuinely ready for everything. Quick whiz through our work, but as Neil has put on the screen, loads and loads of resources on our site if you're interested in taking it further. And of course, I'd love to have a conversation with anyone who would want to have one. Neil, do you want to take it from now?
Good morning, people. Can you hear me? Yes. Apologies, I was just fighting with the technology there. Yeah, so where have we got to? David's talked us through the concept of relationship-centered practice, the fact that it's an end in itself, that it enhances the quality and of our lives, that it's a means to an end, that we think that making empathetic and human-to-human connections is the best vehicle for achieving shared goals and positive change, but also as a universal enabler, so that the contacts and relationships and collaborations that we devise as individuals and as a part of a team suddenly start to be woven together, that they form threads that we can weave together and create a social fabric. And it might be helpful if we think about these types of relationships, excuse me as I try to, there we go, with a bit more intentionality. So how does the process work from an engaged team committed to relationship-centered practice and that are bonded with each other, where they share that sense of identity or similar circumstances? How do we create that aggregate? And this was something we were particularly attentive to following on from the Active Neighbours work in the Relationships Project. Because yes, we saw a shift change in how people looked after each other and looked towards each other. And that's not unusual in a disaster. I spend some of my life walking alongside communities affected by disaster. And what we saw during COVID is typical of what we see everywhere I've been. We see two things that a disaster does. It creates a problem that's bigger than all of us, and it gives us permission to trespass across our normal social boundaries. And we saw that in my street and with local community groups that said, okay, we need to step up here and make sure that if we get through this, we get through this together. So a real increase in that sense of bonding capacity. But what we also saw, particularly with COVID, where in order to keep ourselves safe, we were keeping each other at a distance, but also that is typical with most disasters, that as time moves on, people become tired and different groups start to realize that their needs are different to other groups in the community. And that can have a real impact on how we get on with groups of people that we think are not like us or are physically not near us. So what we saw, I think, during the pandemic, and I'd be interested to hear your views, is bonding up, but bridging down. And we think that's really important, particularly at any time of disaster where communities require assistance from those with more power and more resource, i.e. linking capital. We think that's important because if there aren't strong bridges between communities that may have different needs, but also perceive themselves to have different needs, then attempts at linking can actually create competition and division between communities. So state reaches out and says, how can we help? It picks those groups that are closest or easiest to hear. It responds to their needs, and everybody else in the community says, well, that's not fair, and we know who's doing better than us. So how do we start to overcome those things? How do we bridge some of those divides. Sue kindly introduced me as a community mediator. That's kind of what I do. And over the years, I've spent a lot of time using any technique that I can get my little hands on, as long as it works, really helping communities that are either in situations where relationships are broken down and violence has broken out, or that are coping with something that's bigger than all of them, like a disaster. And what we tried to do with the Bridge Builders Handbook and the links in the chat is to bring together some of what I think are the core principles that underpin good bridge building and some simple processes. And the idea there is that we give communities a resource so that we give them an insight into what it's like to think like a mediator, not too much because it hurts your head, but also actually what some of those techniques might be if they wanted to build bridges across their community. And underpinning the handbook are some core principles. And I think you'll see reflections of these when you think back to David's slide about what are the characteristics of relationship-centered practice. And firstly, we believe that to build good bridges, we need to acknowledge that difference is strength. And that's because solid bridges need strong foundations, a strong sense of who we are, how we do things, and what we stand for. A strong community includes people who think, act, and look differently to us. And we set out our stall there because often when seeking to build bridges with others, we see people jump straight into searching for the commonality and shying away from what makes us different to each other. But having a clear and strong identity is important to our sense of belonging and is an essential foundation for any bridge building work. We must not try to flatten what makes us different, but instead see it as a source of strength. And by exploring our foundations and understanding what makes us different, it gives us an essential starting point. It gives us our foundations. Oops. Apologies. And we think those foundations are really important because if we were entering into an attempt to join with each other and to understand groups that are different, we'll need to see disagreement in a different way. Disagreement or conflict is so often seen as something that's negative, and sadly that's often how it plays out in society. And that's because when we think of conflict, we often think of destructive consequences. We think of the shouting, we remember the violence, we remember the hurt, and we think of revenge. We see conflict as something that emerges from two or more parties thinking that their goals are entirely incompatible. Conflict transformation encourages us to see that in a different way. That actually conflict is the energy for change. And by bringing different groups together about issues they care about, we can unleash that potential. And to do that, we need to think beyond the simple thinking of winning or losing. We need to use our different perspectives to understand the problem better, to see the situation from someone else's eyes and someone else's shoes, to explore what could be achieved if we combined our resources to achieve a goal that meets both our needs. And by doing so, we create a powerful catalyst. And that comes with some careful self-work. Because it's easy, so easy in the way that we think and the way that we speak and the way that we act, that quite quickly those differences become symbols of the other as being the enemy. And we become trapped in our thinking and our speaking. We quite often use the language of blame and judgment when really we're trying to express an unmet need. We quite often see the other group and attribute values to their behaviours instead of circumstances and legitimate reasons. And we stop being curious about the other and we start to know. And we know why they did what they did in the past. And more importantly, why they're going to do what they are going to do in the future, and therefore how we should react. And we get stuck in these cycles of either or win and lose. And if we acknowledge that and we start to become curious, if we set our intentions clearly, our intentions that our aim through our contact and our dialogue with the different group is to find out more. It's to increase that sense of connection. And our curiosity allows us to imagine what's important to the other group and why it's important to them. To start to hear through what's in their head around the situations they're in and why they see the world differently, but also to start to listen to their heart, to connect with what's really important. And by doing that, we move away from either or, and we start to embrace the energy of both and thinking, where we start to look for relationship, where we start to look for goals that also increase the quality of our relationships. And if we do that, if we've moved beyond enemy thinking, the thinking that restricts the outcome of our disagreement to winning and losing, what becomes possible? Well, what becomes possible is when we start to understand our values, our needs, and the activities we do that meet them, we will see that on the distant shore. And with care and with time, we can start to identify what our keystone might be. The keystone that sits in the middle of the bridge and sits there, holds it together, but belongs to neither shore. It is the structure, the shared need that we wish to commit to. And the key to that is making sure that what we're committing to is what Johan Galtung describes as legitimate goals. So a goal that we both want, and most importantly, that doesn't harm the other group. What do I mean by that? So instead of us asking, how do we keep that group out of the park so it's safer for my children, we start to ask maybe, how can we make the park safer for all our children and accessible to other members of the community? And I think this is an important thing, and I reflect back on the conversations what we've heard from Jesse in terms of evaluation and what Nick's going to guide us through. And my fear sometimes is that when we set our sights on a goal, we think there is a linear journey to get there. And I'm not sure that's the reality of how communities work or how relationships work. Quite often when we talk about conflict transformation, we suggest it's a bit like having a compass, but not a map. So we set our sights on the bright light, the positive horizon. But we know the actual journey to get there is uncertain. And I think that's important for two reasons. One, because it reflects the life cycle of we get to a point of being excited, we deliver, we get stuck, we fall down a bit. But also it keeps us clear-eyed on the fact that a good relationship-centered practice where we combine empathy with autonomy is one where we keep our eyes not only the destination, but also the quality of the journey, and making sure that if we make that journey, we all reach the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David and Neil. I found that inspiring, really pushing me to a different way of thinking. The notion of relationships being an end in itself, means to an end, universal enabler, there's so much truth in that. Very useful insights there, and practical insights for us as well about working within communities and boosting volunteering, actually understanding volunteers. Masses there. Thank you very, very much. It does set us up really well for the second half of the session. But before we take a break, we have about 7 or 8 minutes for any observations or questions you might have for David and Neil. I'm not sure we're going to handle this because I can't see everybody on the screen at the moment. So maybe Jessie can help me to see if there are any hands up amongst our participants, and to draw my attention to their names, please, Jessie. Or if there's anything in the chat that we might be able to use. There are so many people in the room that this is a little bit tricky to handle. Jessie?
Yeah, I shall do that. I'm just looking across. Either raise a real hand or put a hand in the
That's right.
yeah.
The little yellow hand. Yeah.
A little yellow hand. That's what I'm talking about. A
yeah.
little yellow hand. Lots of people with cameras off. Lots of people being quiet, maybe.
Yeah. Well, shall I? If you can't see any hands up.
No.
No. Can I maybe? Yeah. Can I maybe ask a question? Particularly, I was interested in the categorization of the volunteers. And one of the challenges, of course, is to maintain volunteer numbers after COVID. Could there be a practical use for some of that work? And I suppose I'm asking David this question because he presented it. Could that be used in practical ways to attract and sustain volunteers now that people are a little bit more relaxed and some are drifting away from volunteering?
That's exactly its purpose, yes, because I think that what we were trying to understand with that piece of work is what were the motivations, and therefore what are the ways in which people are most likely to be encouraged to remain involved. And as my very quick romp through that work illustrated, they are different things for different people, but that doesn't mean that we can't categorize in a way that points us in a helpful direction. I think one of the other aspects that come out of it is that particular category of practical taskers who got involved when the pandemic and the lockdown was at its height are the group that are most likely to have fallen away now. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't come back into the mix with the right kind of encouragement and the right kind of opportunity. There's two things there, both understanding what the opportunity might be and the encouragement might be. The second is ensuring that they have been, as it were, hibernated well. And we look around at some schemes where they know they've been thanked, their contribution has been acknowledged, perhaps it's been celebrated in some way. They feel good about what they did. In other contexts, people feel they were just kind of abandoned and their contribution wasn't recognized. It's not too late, if we're not making best use of those people at the moment, to hibernate them well, to celebrate that achievement and to keep them warm, as it were, for the future. Final thought on all that: there are now across the country, I think, something like 30,000 warm centres, which is a sort of the next, it feels to me a little bit like the next generation mutual aid, ways in which people are gathering together, not just for warmth to help with the cost of living crisis, but also with connecting with one another. So I was speaking last week, someone who's involved in running one of those warm centres, and he was saying they came for the warmth, they stayed for the connection. So I think there are ways in which we can evolve some activities that we're involved with at the moment with an understanding of that breakdown of volunteers that helps to sustain that commitment.
Thank you very much indeed, David. That's really helpful. Fiona, can I hand across to you? You've got your hand up, Fiona from WCVA.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentations, really thought-provoking. Interested in your remark, David, about, I can't remember what you were quoting, about the increase in volunteers since 2019, because our experience in Wales is that it's actually the current recruitment of volunteers is a real issue. I suppose one of the indicators we look at as well is the number of people going onto our All Wales volunteering website. That has drastically gone down since pre-COVID levels. It peaked in COVID and is now about 50% of just the number of people going onto the website than it was pre-COVID. So we're having quite a lot of conversations about, I won't call it a crisis, that's over dramatizing, but there's a real challenge for organizations in recruiting of volunteers. I was thinking that the kind of categorizing that you described of volunteers is actually really useful information for organizations. It just helps people to recognize that people volunteer for so many different reasons. the way you talk to people, the way you approach people, the way you frame the offer, the way you support it, all kind of needs to be tailored to what people's understanding is and ambition is when they sort of volunteer for anything.
Okay.
So I do think there's something really useful, and I'm thinking, you know, there could be scope to make use of some of this sort of information and point people to some of your work. Volunteers Week is coming up, I'm thinking, and we could actually, you know, find ways, I think, of conveying some of that, precisely because the kind of questions about how can we recruit better are very much alive at the moment.
Thank you very much, Fiona. That's more a statement, important statement rather than a question. So I'm going to move swiftly on. Thank you for that. We have time for one more, and I can see two hands up, Rianne and Mark. Rianne, you were first. Can I?
I'm going to let Mark hand over.
Are you going to?
I
Well, that's very generous of you as the chair of Resourceful Communities Partnership. Thank you very much. Mark, would you like to kick off with your question and maybe address it to Neil?
It's an observation really in response to Fiona's question, that I think what the relationship project stuff talks to is going beyond traditional volunteers. It's the everyday people, neighbours, friends and associates, and I've mentioned circles of support. These are people who wouldn't typically sign up to fill a form in to become a volunteer, that are there ready to be asked, and the pandemic was the ask. And so how do we facilitate that in an everyday basis? Because a lot of people will help and support, but they don't want to go through the process of becoming a formal volunteer. Am I right, David and Neil?
Yeah, Neil, would you like to come in there? And we'll give David a chance as well.
Yeah, I think so. From all the bits in the observatory, there's one that I loved more than any other in terms of the comments, and it was from one of the practical taskers that was involved in picking up prescriptions for people, getting shopping, etc. And they talked about previous volunteering experiences, and they turned around and said, yeah, I was a volunteer once, and then I ended up as treasurer and I had to move. And I think it just tells me something about that sense of we assume that there is one way of volunteering and it fits within our box. And when I saw those in government announce an army of volunteers, I was screaming at anything that would listen, because that's not what we see. And I think the opportunity, and I shouldn't say that in terms of a disaster, but it's a catalyst that shows actually what human nature really is, and that maybe some of the ways that we've been thinking constricts some of that energy, and people feel that it's an ongoing commitment they have to make, etc. And I'm just wondering if this shows us a glimpse into other ways where we can unlock some of that human desire, just to help those that are humans like ourselves. And I also loved in the chat, just to say, Mark, I think it was you, not only the importance of things like circles of support, but the importance of things like intentionality, because we assume that these things will just happen by themselves. And that's certainly not my experience. You've got anything else there, David?
Thank you.
Just a couple of thoughts. Fiona, I am fascinated by your experience, and I think it is a messy picture, and the figures I was referring to here really quite spectacular in that increase, but other figures not dissimilar from your own, and would love to continue that conversation and see if there was anything practical that could come out of that in terms of understanding why there is this variable picture. Just to add one other thing. I absolutely agree with what you were saying, Mark, about some of the distinctions between those who might identify as very formal volunteers and those who are active in their communities but wouldn't identify in that way. A phrase that keeps coming back to me and that we've heard used over and over again are people who say, no, I don't do any volunteering, I'm not really a carer, I just do what anyone would do. And I think, how do we create communities where everybody has got somebody who is prepared to do what anyone would do, if you follow that peculiar kind of logic? How do we create that ecology, you might say? Local authority, what is the role for local authorities there? I don't think it is just to step back and do nothing, but what can be done in a way that doesn't kill off what makes that spirit beautiful. And I think too often we do, with good intentions, try to structure it in a way that does actually damage that spirit. How do we create the enabling environment in our communities that enables that to flourish? without organisations like ours necessarily needing to be able to count the numbers or own the people who are part of that movement. And I think we can see some examples of good practice around that, but they're scattered and few and far between. That's what we need to build on, and part of what we need to learn from. We would be really excited in working with any of you who are interested in thinking through that more.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for that offer, David. I'm sure many of us will be taking it up. So welcome back, everybody. I'm going to now hand over to Nick Andrews to run the rest of the session today, the workshop. He'll set the scene for the workshop and also chair the discussion afterwards. So I think many of you know Nick, but in case you don't, for the odd person who doesn't know him, Nick is a registered social worker, and he's had a vast experience of working in social work, social care and social education across both the children's and adult services. But since 2013, which is when he came into my life, he has been he has been working in the School of Health and Social Care at Swansea University, where he leads on DEEP, the Developing Enriched Evidence-Enriched Practice, and has gone from strength to strength and has done some fantastic work. He's been a great influencer in the use of qualitative methods and the use of research in decision making. So I'm going to, without further ado, hand over to Nick. And Nick, now and again, I'll give you a little nudge to keep to time if necessary. Hopefully that won't be necessary. So welcome, Nick.
Well, great. Thanks everyone for your time, because I know how precious it is. Firstly, Jessie said at the start about using some evaluation methods for lived experience. Just to say, if anybody's interested in most significant change or magic tragic moments, which are methods around capturing experience and outcomes, then do contact me. What we wanted to focus on this afternoon is it's this link between evaluation and then this thing about relationships, because it's a slippery fish, isn't it, really? And we want you to sort of start to look at that a bit. So I've got a few slides as an introduction, if that's okay. And then we're going to put you into breakout rooms for about 20 minutes and set you a couple of questions to explore evaluation and the relational aspects of evaluation. So I'm just got a couple of slides to get us started, to set the scene. There we go. I'm beginning. Okay, does that come up? So it's interesting. It goes back to this thing that so much evaluation is focused on outcomes, isn't it, and end results. But there's so much more to community-led action than outcomes. And this, we think it's beautifully summed up by this cartoon by James Norbury, who's a Swansea-based illustrator and author. And he does a series of books around giant Big Panda and Tiny Dragon. So here's the quote: "Which is more important?" asked Big Panda, "the journey or the destination?" So it's an interesting question. But of course, Tiny Dragon says, "Well, the company." I think that's really important, isn't it? I think some of the stuff that Neil and David have been saying is you get the relationships right and stuff happens, really, and your focus should be on those relationships, on the company. And we don't always do that in the world of evaluation, because we're very much more interested in process than people sometimes, aren't we? And outputs and things like that. But actually, in any community development journey, it's the company and the relationships that are the glue and the lifeblood, really, of any activity. And I know the same from partnership working. I was a place-based social worker for years, and it's that the dynamic of the relationship enabled us to do interprofessional working. So it's across the board. So and just a very short, punchy quote from Oliver Escobar. Again, I don't know if anybody read Public Dialogue and Deliberation by Oliver, but it's fantastic. He's into participatory democracy. He's a guy based in Edinburgh University, but he says clearly relationships create the context for change. So getting relationships right, once you've got that, stuff happens, he says, and sometimes we worry about the stuff happening when we don't put the attention into the relationships. And he says, no, you get the relationships going, stuff will happen, and it'll be good. So that's a really important quote. And earlier in the chat, I put a paper about evaluation in community development, and this is just a little extract from it. Evaluation criteria often do not seem to emphasize bottom-up community development approaches and appear to focus on logic and measurable results sometimes missing important relationships and difficult to manage criteria. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that paper, because it goes into the complexity of evaluating community development. It's not like evaluating a machine. It's a much more complex thing. And I think the paper points that out beautifully. So I'd encourage you to look at that. And then finally, I came across a lovely little paper. It was around, and it had this phrase, relational accountability. And it was a team of researchers who were doing research within a group of Indigenous young people. I think it's a Canadian study. But it was really interesting. They said, there's all that stuff we come at as researchers when we're working with the community, but there's this stuff happening between us and the people we're working with in truly participatory methods. That is something very special, and we need to think about this and reflect on this. So, and this is a little quote from that paper. One of us compared the group to a family where everyone jokes and teases, but most importantly, supports one another and finds joy in the achievements and accomplishments of the group and the achievements and accomplishments of individual members of the group. So this relational aspect of the participatory research, they said, we need to look at this because it's really important. So that is setting the scene. So for about 20 minutes, with your permission, we've got a small group exercise. So what we'd like you to do, we're going to put you into small groups. Devan's going to do that kindly for us. And we'd like you, once you're in the groups, to nominate somebody who do feedback. We haven't got a lot of time for feedback, but we would like somebody to, in the groups, to do feedback. Oh, I'm not sure how to make of that. So here's what we're thinking you'll do in the small groups. We'd like you to share examples from your experience in community action where relationships play or will play a key part. So we want you to focus on your experience of relationships, whether it's, whatever it is, because you're coming from diverse backgrounds. And then we've got these 2 questions. I'll put these in the chat for you. What has helped or would help in putting relationships at the heart of that work? So we would want to think about, if relationships is the glue to everything, what does it look like in your context? But then importantly, we'd like you to start to think about, how did you or could you evaluate that relationship dimension? How would you go about getting a temperature check on relationships? And that's what we'd like you to explore, because we think this is, and again, we're not saying there's any easy answers to this, but we think it's important to start to dive into. So I'll stop sharing there, and then I'll put the questions again in the chat. So I don't know how people got on, but it was, we had a fantastic conversation in our room, and we soon got into the complexity and the depth of the whole thing, really. So I hope you did too. It was lovely. We had some. So where do we start? We start with groups 1. We're just going to give you a little opportunity for feedback, if that's okay, and just picking out 1 or 2 things that you discussed. Ideally, if say, because we've got shortage of time, really, is if not to repeat what a previous group has said, but if you think something a previous group has said is the thing that you think is the most important, then do feel free to sort of say, I'm glad they said that because we felt that too. But the more we can tease out, the better, really. So, and something around what sort of putting relationships at the center looks like, and then a little bit about how perhaps we might get a measure of that, really. Okay, so should we start with group 1? Dovan could remind people who are in group 1.
Yeah, so in group 1 was Amy, Frank, Kerry, Liz, Louise, and Tria.
Anybody want to feedback? Again, don't feel pressurized if you don't want to.
I think you've got me, Nick, and I've got the easy turn because I'm going first. So
thanks, Rhian.
In terms of question 1, we touched on quite a number of different things. There were 3 things that came through, though. One was about language, and how as professionals we're often talking our own language that other people don't understand or connect with. The importance around physical connections in building relationships, so shaking someone's hand, spending time alongside somebody, being able to show empathy and compassion, we felt was easier face to face than perhaps online or over the phone. And then the conversation, so actually, spending that time listening to somebody, actively listening, the time, the kind of giving someone faith that you're there alongside them. So that's a very quick synopsis of question 1. Question 2, I think we probably had more questions than answers. So for us, I think what came through is probably we don't really evaluate relationships at present. We evaluate the outcome or the objective of what the service is there to deliver. But I think there was a recognition that we this has kind of alerted people to the fact, this conversation, that actually we need to shift in that. And where there had been some attempts, often it was dependent on the willingness of people to engage and participate in the evaluation.
That's lovely, spot on. Thank you, Rhian. What about group 2? And who's group 2, Devan?
Group 2 was Amy, Bessie, Billy, David, Fiona, Iona, and Rachel.
You've got me. Hi.
Oh, well done, Rachel. You're in good hands.
I spoke too much, so I accidentally volunteered myself. We actually talked quite a bit about some really specific scenarios, and that brought about a lot of conversation about how building relationships can enhance communities' voice. So through both as professionals being able to talk directly with communities because we have a good relationship with them, but also in terms of building relationships with other professionals, other organizations, meaning that we can better enhance the relationship we have with other communities that we're not currently talking with. And then on to kind of question 2, really talking about how we can measure that. The immediate response was, we'll let you know when we figure that out, but essentially that it would be narrative based. We don't exactly know when it can be evaluated. It's possible to plot milestones towards that, but not necessarily we don't know what a definitive evaluation of that would look like. But one way of looking at it would be to evaluate power relationships. So seeing people who have previously been excluded being more bold and having more of a voice in their communities or in the kind of the services that they use. Yes, it's about sort of seeing people more often and hearing their voices.
It's interesting relationship, because Scott in our group talks about piggybacking the police, because the fire service, people are happy with the fire service, but they're not just a bit more wary of the police. And that was really interesting how they've used a piggybacking they come along, bringing the police with them, and that was interesting. But
Nick, sorry to be a party pooper, but we've got 7 minutes left. And
okay, group 3.
Chair, I intend to finish on time. Fascinating conversation, but I think that we should reduce the feedback a little bit further, because I know that people have got meetings to go on to. So if we could just press the pace, please.
Okay, for group 3.
Group 3, Debbie, Gemma, Neil, and Tina.
So I'm feeding back from our group, and I think the key thing that we wanted to highlight was the importance of giving time to the work that you're doing and helping to educate the people who are potentially commissioning or working with you, working alongside you, that an arbitrary time frame often doesn't work for co-produced and successful relationships, and the importance of those relationships being kind of mutually invested in across all the partners in order for them to be effective and to take time to bed in and be sustainable.
Thank you, Gemma. Anything about the measurements you want to?
Sorry, I just clicked the wrong button. A lot of it was, certainly from my point of view, that is something that we're not doing at the moment, and it's not something that we're able to evidence and demonstrate. So there's a real opportunity. I'm just speaking for me at CTA. It's not something reflective of the group, but that there are tools available, and it's been really empowering this session to actually think about how we might be able to employ some of those in practice.
Great, it'd be lovely to link up with you. I know David's got, again, sorry Sue, I'm just being quick, but a guy in the States who's doing some work around, he did David K. Yeah, so if you're interested in this, we can have conversations after today.
Yeah, that would be great, thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, group 4.
Group 4 was Sue's group. I don't know if Sue wants to.
Yeah. Yes, I'm very happy to feedback. Just to add a couple of things to what's already been said, we had a very different discussion around community relationship building within communities through community development, and when external agencies are involved, and the issues that came up were, building trust, being honest, keeping dialogue going, scaling up good personal relationships, sharing outcomes and community pride. And on the evaluation, we said there's a complexity here. Both sides of the equation need to be talked with, and outputs mustn't be forgotten either. What came through very strongly was the process is as important as what you're trying to achieve in any management where decisions are made. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, we had it. Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you, Sue. And group 5, am I right now?
That was your group, Nick.
Okay, so that's
Emma.
me.
We've
Yeah,
got it,
hi, 5. So we've said a few of the things already, but we also said about kind of knowing the community and how many different communities can be within one community. So kind of not blanketing your approach to a whole area. Also about making sure, I suppose, we know the backgrounds of communities and how we work with them. Someone in the group was mentioned how a relationship with a certain organisation has become a bit more distant recently, so the way they work with that community has had to change. And then on question 2 side of things, we spoke a lot about how the qualitative data is probably the most fruitful for kind of getting that evaluative feedback, but also the quantitative data is also really helpful because it means we get a more, I suppose, non-cherry picked idea of what's going on. And then lastly, we said about with partnership working, it means that you get the outcomes from different organisations. And again, one of the examples were, you know, from the police knowing crime rates are down in certain areas, and from other maybe organisations and the kind of results that they've seen through maybe community work.
Could I ask, somebody hasn't got their mute button pressed and there's a lot of background voices. Yeah, so if you could all, while somebody's speaking, put yourself on mute, please. Thank you.
Another little thing from that group was around the little things, attention to little things that matter to people. I think that was really important. It was like somebody spent 2 years getting a dog poo bin, but that dog poo bin was really important. And yeah, in terms of building relationship. And last but not least, then we're on group 6.
I think it's me, Nick.
Yeah,
happy for me too. Yeah. The first thing that came through about what would help in developing relationships was creating more balance. So hearing the hidden voices. There was a message that often it's the sort of the loudest, most frequent voices that come through. And so actually creating opportunities where the quieter voices come through creates more balance and therefore better relationships. And the other was about developing informal conversations across projects. So everyday conversations were valuable for building relationships where people could just say who they were rather than formal networks. So the informality of building relationships is important rather than networks. And on question 2, again, I think echo much of what's been said, that there's certainly scope for evaluation, a willingness, but sometimes the requirements of funders stipulate certain metrics which are problematic.
Fantastic. Well, that's brilliant. I mean, we could have spent the whole afternoon, couldn't we, sort of unpicking some of this, but it was a good start for 10. Sue, I'll shut up.
Thank you ever so much, Nick, and thank you for your feedback. There was obviously a lot of rich discussion going on, and I'm hoping that much of this will be captured through the end of course report.